How many summers like this one do you imagine that we can expect?
Black Lives Matter! Oh my God, I got chills. This looks so good.
In the summer of 1964, Harlem erupted into protests which soon turned into riots in response to the police killing of James Powell. Similar protests and riots have seen a resurgence in recent years, culminating after the police murders of Philando Castile in 2016, George Floyd in 2020, and countless other names and communities across America that we hold in remembrance. Between the Black Lives Matter movement as well as the recent discourse surrounding critical race theory, there is a lot of ongoing conversation about racism and its impact on our history. Of the many things said, however, there is a resounding theme among conservative speakers to claim that systematic racism ended with civil rights, or more concerningly, that it is a myth altogether. My hope is to tackle these claims, and while there is much to be said in light of current news, I will be focusing specifically on America's history and what it can show us. Our timeline begins in the 1490s, as the coming century would mark the start of North American colonization as well as the transatlantic slave trade. By the time the Constitution was ratified in the 1790s, over 6.5 million people had already been victim to the slave trade. The Constitution, however, did not guarantee its freedoms equally, and African Americans would have to wait nearly a century before things would begin to change. In the 1860s, the North questioned the profitable industry of slavery, leading to one of the bloodiest wars in our nation's history. By the time the institution of slavery was finally over, it created a diaspora of over 12 million people, and it's worth noting that it was the labor extracted from these individuals that formed the backbone of American infrastructure and allowed for our economic prosperity. After being liberated from their circumstances, they did not receive any substantive justice. They were not granted equal rights, nor were they provided restitution from their bondage, despite the promises of the U.S. government. With the system of slavery gone, there was a concerted effort to establish new systems, including voter restrictions, Jim Crow laws, and sharecropping. These maintained the systematic oppression of non-white Americans and kept in place the inexpensive labor market. Racially motivated hate crimes such as lynchings were common practice, and the existence of sundown towns was a given. People of color continued to endure these inhumane circumstances and in some cases even managed to flourish despite them. One such community was that of Tulsa, Oklahoma, who managed to find prosperity in pre-civil rights America. They, like many others, however, were not allowed to flourish long, as a racist mob descended on the city in 1921, massacring its black inhabitants. This tragedy took place over 20 years after the Civil War ended, and it would be over 40 more until the civil rights movement would gain traction. A movement which, like the Civil War, was not a unanimous decision. Countless public officials openly espoused racist ideology in their attempts to curtail the movement, and the FBI actively pursued investigations to quash the voices of those who called for equal rights. At one point even going so far as to have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the FBI's most wanted. Although we may want to look back on these movements and remember their importance, we cannot overlook the fact that they were opposed at almost every level of governance. It was civil disobedience and refusal to participate in exploitative systems that won the fight for civil rights, not the decision of legislators to suddenly do the right thing.
I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the nation began undergoing enormous change. However, that change has been gradual. It put to an end practices like redlining, which until the 1970s prevented black Americans from accessing valuable real estate, and thus diminishing their ability to generate intergenerational wealth and ensuring that more people of color rent rather than hold equity in their home. A brief note about real estate and intergenerational wealth: Homestead Acts were government-sponsored programs which freely gave land to white Americans and can be traced back as the root of many Americans' wealth today. Although the Civil Rights Act banned explicit racism in legislation, as with the abolishment of slavery, a new system took root. That, however, will be the subject of my next video, which will be breaking down the timeline from civil rights to the modern day. Now that we have a basic timeline established, I'll be getting to the point. If we were to put this over a football field, it would look something like this, where every 10-yard line is 60 years and the field covers a range from 1490 to 2090, or 600 years. This method works particularly well because the ratification of the Constitution and the founding of the U.S. takes place right at the midpoint, or the 50-yard line. We can place key moments from the timeline here to give us a better idea of scale and the time that it takes to effect change. We can also just see how recent it was in our history that this so-called equality was attained. In the 1490s, colonization and slavery reached North America, intercepting the ball and making a break for it. Their running back slave labor took off sprinting, making it well past the 50-yard and continuing on after the Constitution was established. Then, in 1890s, Abe Lincoln came in, tackling slave labor, injuring them and taking them out of the game for good. Team racism then subbed in Jim Crow and sharecropping, who together got the ball to the 1960s, where finally Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers dogpiled on, putting a stop to team racism yet again. But the ball has kept on moving. Today it's January 23rd, 2022, and Martin Luther King Jr. Day has just passed. We are still having discussions about racial disparities in America, and is it really hard to see why? If we look at this timeline, it doesn't speak well of our ability to leave antiquated ideas in the past. With the founding of the nation, Americans were forced to look at the question of who deserves the rights that we hold most sacred, and we decided to uphold the system that got us this far, rather than the truth of human rights. Later, when faced with the absolute immorality of slavery, we were forced to answer another question. What will we choose, decency or profit? And half of the nation took up arms against the other to defend their right to profit off of treating their fellow man like property. Even after losing a war to maintain their so-called right, many lived on to uphold those same racist systems, going as far as to massacre those few minorities who dared to climb too high and instituting new prejudice laws to hinder their socioeconomic mobility. In order to overturn the structures which were built after slavery, it took an enormous effort from countless Americans to show the government that they meant business. There were both peaceful protests and riots, when the protests became ineffective at reaching dispassionate legislators, work stoppages and marches in the Capitol that forced those who benefited from the systems to act, else the whole thing would collapse. For nearly 70% of our history since claiming this land as our own, it was legal, acceptable, and profitable to own and abuse others. For nearly 90% of our history, people of color were legally discriminated against and actively prevented from establishing a living. It took us nearly 200 years to extend our fundamental value of freedom to an entire population based solely on an immutable characteristic, something which we have done to several groups throughout our time as a nation. The claim that the ghosts of our past haunt us no more is a fairy tale, one which exists to protect the feelings of people like me, white people. It is a claim which allows us to ignore the role that these ideas may have played in our upbringing and how they may seep into our subconscious. It allows us to pretend that the fortune of our forefathers, and more importantly the misfortune of others, bear no impact on the modern day. From the time that slavery was outlawed, it took the country a century of violence and turmoil to finally grant equal rights to its citizens. The idea that the impact of slavery could be so resounding but suddenly disappear as soon as the Civil Rights Act passed is ridiculous. It purposefully overlooks the lasting damage of centuries of discrimination, oppression, and false promises. That is the cost of the comfort that this fairy tale brings. We ought to question who benefits from the belief that these problems disappeared and, more importantly, who is harmed. Because every day that we go unchecked on our own personal bias, our own prejudice is a day that it may somehow be weaponized and used against another. This is true for everyone, but especially those of us who have already benefited from the systems in place. And for those of you who may not feel that you have been directly benefited, perhaps it would be better to think about it as a lack of having been harmed.
How many summers like this one do you imagine that we can expect?
I think the answer about how long it will take will depend on the federal government, on the city halls of our various cities, and on white America to a large extent. This is where we are at this point, and I think white America will determine how long it will be and which way we go in the future.
Thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. It means more than you'll ever know, and if you care about this subject, I'll be trying to get up part 2 sometime soon. If you found anything that you loved or hated, please feel free to comment below, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.